In science, it's the innovators who ask bolder questions to solve bigger challenges. That's the mission of innovative teams like yours and ours. In support of your goals, the Fisher Scientific team keeps science moving forward by offering over 2 million products globally, including lab supplies, instruments and equipment, safety products, chemicals, and life science reagents. In science, it's the...
Hello, everyone. My name is Edie Stringfellow, and I'm the Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with the Massachusetts Biotechnology Council. Thank you for joining us today for MassBio's Makeshift Happen program, where we discuss anything and everything related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and engagement. I would also like to thank our partner, Thermo Fisher, for powering today's program. We have been working with the Fisher Scientific Leadership Team to bring an elevated focus to diversity spend. Now, before we get, I would like to go over ground rules. For today, the first 20 minutes, it will be a Q&A portion between me and the guest, but please do not hesitate to ask a question or make a comment. You can also add them to the chat section. And I want the program to be interactive. So for the following 20 minutes after we will go through the questions that's through the chat section and asked by the audience. And the program ends around 2:40 with a hard stop at 2:45 Eastern Standard Time. Now let's get started. In the era of innovation, artificial intelligence promises to make research and drug development processes better, faster, and more cost efficient, as well as provide personalized care to patients and healthcare members. But can the designers who develop these technologies subconsciously impact its outcomes on patients and care? Today, we will talk about why do biases occur in advanced next generation technologies? And what will it take to ensure AI algorithms are more inclusive of diverse and underrepresented populations? And as for a special treat today, some of the attendees will be randomly selected to receive Dr. Fambu's book, The Future of Healthcare: Humans and Machines Partnering for Better Outcomes. And speaking of which, joining me for today's discussion are healthcare futurist, Dr. Emmanuel and AI expert, Peter van der Putten. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, Manny, and what is it that you do?
Sure. So my name is Emmanuel Fambu. I'm a physician by background, and I spent some time earlier in my career, clinical practice, drug development. I work in private equity and did a startup. And back in the industry, working around digital technologies and how they could improve our future society. So right now, I spend a lot of my time dealing with working with startups and in the venture capital world and investment banking.
Well, where are you joining us from today, Manny?
I am based out of New York, but currently in the West Coast, San Francisco, as you can see.
Oh, nice. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Peter, please tell us about yourself and what is it that you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a director for AI, the company called Pega Systems, and we're an enterprise software company. And I look at applications of responsible AI across all kinds of different areas where our clients want to use it, from intelligent automation to member engagement, etc. And next to that, I'm also an assistant professor in machine learning and AI at a university in the Netherlands. And the funny accent is Dutch, so I'm talking to you from sunny Amsterdam.
Nice, and we do have Dutch members and Dutch speaking members, so please say hello in your native tongue.
Hey, nou, goede avond dan, of goedemiddag. Ligt eraan waar jullie zijn. Hartstikke leuk.
Well, thank you for joining us and taking the time. I know that it is a time zone difference for all of us here, so let's get it started. Peter, where you just left off, what is this AI thing anyway? Can you walk the audience through it, explain it? Is it new? What are its key ingredients?
Yeah, I mean, it's an awesome question because when you read the news, when you follow that a little bit, it sounds like it's something new or even something futuristic, you know, at some point in the near future, the robots will come and they will enslave us all. That's of course a common AI meme, but AI has been around for quite a while. It's not really that new. You know, the whole term was coined in the Dartmouth workshop in 1956. 1956, yeah, where all kinds of people, not just computer scientists, but also cognitive scientists and linguists came together to think about, you know, what is intelligence and how can we basically put it into computers. And that underlying question of what is intelligence, where does it come from, how can systems, people, animals learn? Yeah, that's of course a question that we humans have been interested in for centuries. So in that sense, it goes way back. Also, its key ingredients are also quite old. You know, like already from the start of AI, let's say in the 1940s, you had people like Turing. You know, he built the first, he cracked the Enigma computer, but also wrote the first computer chess program, and he used logic. You know, reasoning, rules. You know, not just what are the best rules to play chess, but also how can I win a particular game? But of course, that begs then the question, how do I become intelligent? How could I ever become better if the rules are just being put into the machine? And that's where the idea of machine learning comes from. And also already in the 1940s, people were working actually at MIT, just around the corner, on neural networks. So McCulloch and Pitts were systems that were able to learn from data, loosely mimicking to how our cells in our brains are connected. And even nowadays, maybe the machine reasoning, that's a little bit good old-fashioned AI, a little bit what people see as classical expert systems. And it sounds like everyone is talking more about the machine learning part of AI, but actually both ingredients are still there, and both are actually quite important. Also from an ethical point of view, because the rules may actually help to keep the reasoning, and the rules may help to keep the machine learning under control.
Well, thank you for that explanation. Let's go over to Manny. Manny, if you would mind, let's back up a little. In your title, you call yourself a healthcare futurist. For those who are part of the audience right now who are not familiar with the term, can you explain to us what that is?
Sure. The term comes from a core belief from my experience in medicine and drug development, where I realized that even the discussions around all these new technologies were more focused around disease states, or we label people patients and non-patients, right? Which is another problem, because I don't think anyone is in a permanent state of being a patient, right? We all transition. At one point, you might have a headache, you might have cancer, you might have whatever it is. It's not those patients, it's us, right? We are those people. And so I believe that for the best way, as humanity in general, where medicine should be in general, should be around this idea of having informed insights about each individual and how we live our lives, whether you're sick or healthy, but we should be making informed decisions on how we live life going forward. That's the kind of mentality that I advocate for. So even if you're a patient or you're healthy, you should still, you know, be able to collect data sets to understand what makes your mood happy, right? What's the right lighting for you, right? If you're sick and diabetic, like what's the right time for you to take your injections? Are there other things that could make you happier? About the overall quality of life driven by technology, that's the mindset of what I'm a huge advocate for.
Now, Peter talked about old-fashioned AI, and you're talking about the future of healthcare. Help us bridge the gap. What could be the cause or the bias that's driving AI decisions and making it biased? Can you give us a healthcare example?
Sure, which is very interesting. The reason why I actually wrote my first book, Future Healthcare, was based on the idea of spending time around a lot of people like Peter, right? Understanding what they were doing and realizing the impact of this to society in general, right? To healthcare, whether you're a clinician. And when I looked at it, I realized that logic, which is a class I took in college, but I never realized the impact of what that logic class would play a role like later in my life. And the idea was that's how doctors make decisions, right? If you go to a doctor, you go in and they fill out, they do blood pressure check, they ask you questions, family history, and then you go through something called differential diagnosis. So the clinician in your mind is saying, based on these symptoms, if Peter shows up, for example, and Peter has abdominal pain, I'm not thinking pregnancy, right? And Peter that's a logical piece of it, right? So it's the right way of thinking. And doctors make decisions based on rational thinking and right, it's logical deductions based on what insights that you give. The less information you share with a doctor, the far off the decision they'll make. That's like way off, right? So that's the kind of idea, and that's basically what we do. If you look at the amount of information that is published every single day, I mean, you're based, I mean, if you just look at Cambridge, for example, the amount of research that comes out of Cambridge in a given day, it's impossible for any other clinician to actually read and understand every single thing that happened today, right? So if you are seeing a doctor in a rural part of the country or even some parts of Boston, you might actually be treating those patients based on old information. And it takes years for clinicians to actually make different, like make better informed decisions. That's one. Two, the way we treat patients today in medicine is like, we have this one big size umbrella that fits.
Mm-hmm.
If you have diabetes, there's a drug for you, right? If you have cancer, this is a drug for you, right? If you have hypertension, this is a drug for you. But it's not personalized to you as a personalized experience. To do that, we require massive amounts of data, like massive amounts of data sets. And to do that, the average human brain is not big enough to hold all that information in. And computers are able to do that for us to help clinicians make better informed decisions. And so I think it's a perfect mix on how we get it done. And the cool part of this is you don't have to become a legend in mathematics, right? You just need to understand how you make decisions on a day-to-day basis, right? If you use a mobile app for driving, right, Google Maps and all this, and it gives you directions, that's all driven by AI and smart decision thinking based on real-time traffic. We are just taking exactly what Peter said he does, right, and applying it to our day-to-day lives to further humanity.
Now, Peter, from the design perspective, what is your views on this?
Yeah, like let me, I'm happy that Manny, that you took a little bit of the optimist view. And at heart, I'm an optimist, but I'll go a little bit dystopian here as well, if you permit. I think because you were also saying, are there potential downside or potential risks? And of course, bias is a big one. Yeah. Whether that's bias because of the mix of patients that you have in your clinical study, or whether it's bias on how you build your models. There could be many ways how this bias could creep in. If I go back to maybe I said in the beginning, there are two key ingredients of AI are machine reasoning and machine learning. Like say a very early example of a machine reasoning system was a system called MySyn. And MySyn would do diagnosis if you had a certain infection, what would be the bacteria behind your infection. And it was based on rules, 600 rules that smart people came up with, doctors, etc. They put them in the system and it actually worked reasonably well. Interesting enough, then this whole ethical debate already kicked in about, how do we know, for example, that even these medical experts, that the rules that we have in the system are the right rules. Yeah, so that could be one source, the logic, even if you have medical protocols or whatever on a piece of paper, you're encoding a certain knowledge, and that knowledge is produced by people, so it could have bias encoded. The other element is more the machine learning. And to give you a healthcare example, there was a study in Science by Obermeyer, and they reported that there was bias in a machine learning model, predictive model that was used for preventative care. So the payer, they built, they wanted to build a system to identify people who in future could develop maybe a certain chronic disease, so that they could, proactively reach out. So all good intentions, but what happened? They built a model on the data set where they said, like, let's say what is the state of people in year one, and how much did we spend on healthcare for these patients in year two? And so you can already see where it's going, unfortunately, because in the US, if you're black and you have exactly the same health conditions as someone who's non-black, less money will be spent. You will be spending less money on healthcare in future, simply because there's different rates of insurance and things like that. So unwillingly, a lot of bias crept into the system because the model was predicting future healthcare costs. Now, it's not that these things cannot be fixed. In this sense, it's just a form of evidence-based medicine. And so, for instance, by what the researchers then did, they said, like, let's try and predict future occurrence of the disease rather than just how much are we going to spend on healthcare in the future, on care in the future. There's still bias in that because there's still underdiagnosed people, etc. But it's better than looking at the total amount of money. Actually, by correcting for that bias, in the data set, more than 2.5 as many black patients would have been eligible for the care management program. 2.5 as many, right? So that gives an indication, how much bias there was in the model. It also gives an indication that it's not, people make it sound like magic AI, white magic or black magic, but it's not magic. Ultimately, it's about data, it's about correlations, but it's also systemically, if people say it's because of the data, doesn't mean that there's no responsibility. Systemically, people need to have an eye open for these type of ethical aspects like fairness and bias, and that they are aware that these problems can occur, and that what the ways are to detect these and what are the ways to actually solve for these, right? So that's the underlying systemic issue, of course, that we need to solve.
Wow, that's, I'm going to ask Manny to help tie this together for me, because you talked briefly about insurance premiums. So Manny, how does the lack of sufficient data sets from certain populations and biases and algorithms lead to the increase in insurance premiums?
That is a scary part of it. So it's funny, in my notes, I actually looked at the insurance piece, right? And if you look at where society is going in general, Peter, that's exactly where we're going, right? Because insurance companies are in the business of risk, right? It's like in the US, like credit reports, right? If you don't have a credit history, then no one gives you credit. In this case, if you don't have data represented, then they gotta make decisions about you. So you become high risk in a certain population. And if you look at outside of, I don't want this to be like an AI kind of problem piece. It's a human problem because humans are biased already by nature. If you look at majority of clinical studies that take place, that is not prostate cancer, which you only need men involved in those studies, right? Women are underrepresented in traditional clinical studies as we sit today. Most drugs are approved in market, right? Women are underrepresented, minorities are underrepresented in these studies, and these drugs are available today. But we expect to get the same benefits out of the drugs, but it's not the same kind of bias, right? So that's one piece. Two, if you look at some of the largest expenses in healthcare, diabetes is one of them, hypertension, heart failure, those are things that cost the most to manage. And if you look at cancer, right, I talk about a great example in St. Louis, where there's a street called the Delma Boulevard that splits the city into northern part and the southern part of that city. And the northern part is predominantly African Americans, and a part of the city, the southern part is more mixed and diverse, but more Caucasians in the lower part. And the median income in the top part is like $38,000, below is over $100,000. The rates of hypertension, diabetes, and cancer are 8 times higher on the northern part than the southern part in the exact same city, right? If you go down to the city and you drive around, look at neighborhoods, you have all your fast food restaurants there, right? You have all the junk grocery stores. You cross that line on the southern part, your Whole Foods, and all your fancy organic vegetable foods. So if you're an insurance company and you have the data sets that you have, and you know there's 10 times more risk of cancer on the northern part of this line, automatically you already have that automatic bias, right? So the algorithms are not only there to help us, but we need to be very proactive about it to make sure we input our data. Otherwise, you'll be penalized for this. So it's very critical and very important, because in the long term, you will all suffer, right? And like Amazon, for example, is a great example. If you look at Amazon's strategy, where Amazon, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you probably make over $100,000 a year, right? If you are, then you're probably into yoga, and you probably could buy organic foods and you live healthier lives, right? That's the Amazon, typical Amazon Prime member. The Amazon acquires Whole Foods. Who goes to Whole Foods? The same category of people that are Prime members, right? Amazon gets into generic drugs. So you don't need, if you're that healthy patient population, you don't need brand drugs. And Amazon gets into health insurance. Who is Amazon insuring? High risk people or low risk people? You see what I'm saying? They're low risk people. So, right. So I'm not surprised Amazon is going to get in that business where you could buy your insurance directly on Amazon. They could tell you what you eat because they know exactly what leads to disease. And if you don't fit that healthy category, you're penalized and you're going to pay more. And that's what's going to happen, which is scary.
That's incredible. I never even tied all that together. Thank you for walking me through that. So how can these algorithms reduce disparities in healthcare?
By
Manny.
Correct. And I think the first piece of this is we have to understand risk within our own populations. And I agree, I accept it for what it is, right? And we need to be proactive to decrease the rates to show better data. That's the only way we can make it better, because no one is going to say, oh, we're going to ignore the fact that, yes, within African Americans, my grandmother died from heart failure, right, herself, right? Diabetes is predominant in my community. I have a risk for hypertension, right, for my genomic kind of testing. I know that. So what do I do to become more proactive about my own healthcare? That is what is going to cut down this premium, to say, yes, I am African American, but because I'm proactive about my healthcare, I decrease your risk. Car insurance companies do that today, right? Where if you let them track you what time you drive, your speed and everything else, you pay less in premium. That's what's going to happen. To do that, we need to be more aware of these biases. I think people are going to actually try to participate more in this. Otherwise, we're on the wrong side of history, right? And so I think we have to be more proactive about it. With that being said, if you look at where this research pieces get done, it's not where you have majority of your minorities there, right? So it's not in your prime areas. Google has a study called the baseline study, right? The baseline study of Project Baseline was based on collecting baseline data on 10,000 people. You could put in your zip code and they'll send you devices like a wearable, mattress sensors, shoe sensors to collect a baseline. And they want to follow you over time to see change from baseline. Mm-hmm. That's exactly the concept Google is trying to do, right? And so if you put your zip code, I mean, I'm in New York City and I put a zip code, no sites, right? Mm-hmm. You go to Cambridge, there's a site. At Stanford, there's a site. If you go to Cambridge, how many people that are of minorities are actually in Cambridge that have access to the researcher in Cambridge to actually participate in the study to get all these like wearables and sensors? No. So the data is, from a baseline perspective, it's already biased, right? And we keep talking about it every single time. Right? I mean, Peter, what do you think?
Peter, jump in. I actually, what we're going to do right now is ask the audience. We're coming up to the bottom half of the program. If the audience would like to ask some questions, please enter them into the chat section. And while they're doing that, Peter, this is very interesting. If you wouldn't mind elaborating on that, because he just made the tie with the data and the insurance and predictive behavior. What happens after that point? What's the connection point after that?
Yeah, so I think as many already outlines, like it starts with understanding that bias can occur and what are the different ways how it can manifest itself, right? So, and that typically also means if you do any evidence-based medicine, is to have a good look at your experimental setup and to have a good look at your data, like many also said. So in this particular example where they built a preventative care model, the big problem was that they were predicting future healthcare costs as opposed to what is the future potential occurrence of the disease, which still has bias, but it's a lot better than just saying, oh, did we spend more than $500 on your health next year? So I think it's important to be aware of those things. And it also means that you need to foster a bit of a culture of responsible application of AI, and including these things like not just bias prevention, but also making sure that the AI is transparent and that the models can provide explanations of, you know, how it actually got to a prediction or decision, right? So it's a mix of tools, methodologies, but ultimately also process and people that we need to apply to make sure that AI is applied responsibly.
And just
So-
to add to that, please, you know, the way to look at this is past in medical research, we'll write and publish papers. You do research, then you publish. With AI, the goal is not to publish papers, is because what you learn from, you could change what happens in the future. It's a future prediction for the model. Right?
That's exactly right. So it's in that sense, it's not, there's two parts to this, what is new and what is not new. What is not new is thinking in terms of evidence and trying to find these correlations and maybe build some kind of diagnosis model or whatever. And now I'm talking about it in the clinical domain, but similar in drug discovery. So that's actually the same, but the rate of application and how much it gets built into closed loop systems, that's of course very different, right? So because AI is already being applied on a huge scale compared to, let's say, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think that's something that really changed. Yeah. So, and I think we need all these pieces of the puzzle. So it's within life sciences or healthcare companies, but also across those companies. You see governments introducing all kinds of forms of regulation, but also specific regulations are being introduced for life sciences. So there's this consort AI that got announced the other day, reporting guidelines for clinical trials that evaluate interventions that have an AI component inside, for example. And so you can see that there's also policy that's being developed that in many different places that applies across companies and organizations. And finally, it's maybe the people that work on it. Unfortunately, it's just hiring, let's say, underrepresented groups is not. It's not a silver bullet. You need these other things as well.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there has been, very nice, an interesting and a little bit of a scary study that was done recently that actually illustrates how difficult this problem is. Because that was researchers for Columbia University, and they did an experiment with around 400 AI engineers, and they gave them lots of tasks. And they had different types of experimental conditions. And then they wanted to see, okay, how much bias is there in the solutions, in the models that they actually produce. And it turned out that things like, whether developers were female or from minority groups, and that really actually didn't impact how much bias there was in the models that they actually built. So they even did a test. There's a certain psychological test for how biased you are as a person. Even that test didn't impact the amount of bias that's in the system. In other words, we all have our biases, right? So we are all biased, and we can all be victims of bias. What did work is, so it was not the case that they could say these groups always are always less biased, but they could prove that it was important to be diverse. And so if groups were diverse in terms of demographics, and so as long as they were diverse, that had a positive impact on avoiding bias in the AI that was being built.
Peter, that's a great part about this diversity and inclusion story. Okay, like I'll tell you, I've had multiple discussions about diversity and inclusion, and we publish papers. No one needs to read a paper to understand that bias happens, right? And bias happens regardless of where you're from, right? Whether it's gender or racial bias or whatever piece of bias. We know that. It's a reality that in my world of me doing things, I don't see many people that look like me. right? I see less people that look like you, right, in the world that I'm in. It is a reality. We all know that. Yep. And in my entire time doing research, I've spent time at Harvard, I've spent time at Stanford, Duke, and all these places. I've never spent time at Howard University, and I've never spent time in Norfolk State University, or right. I mean, I trained in Atlanta, those Morehouse down the street, great medical school, Peace. I work with the doctors there, but I've not done research there. It's always like, let's give a grant to support this program. So we do like a great press release and clap hands and publish papers, right? That's not enough to do it. I think that if we talk about research coming out about bias piece, why not come out of Howard University? Why only out of Columbia? Why is it only at Stanford kind of university to tell the people that are not involved in this? So I think there has to be a proactive kind of approach to go in and say, how do we invest and build these kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems within these communities for them to build solutions that fit their communities, right? Because it's a grassroots approach of it coming up, right? So Peter could volunteer and spend some time and say, listen, let's help coach some of these programs, right? MassBio, for example, has partnerships with some of these universities to bring them in the loop for them to understand what is out there. Because otherwise, you can't blame the fact that the venture community, I don't think that they're trying to be intentionally biased, but if you leave work and you go to your golf club to play, you don't meet people that go to Howard University. So it's kind of hard to say, oh, go be biased. I mean, like, go meet them. Like, you don't know where to meet them. Where do you meet them, right? I mean, it's a very secluded kind of world. So I don't think it's intentional bias, but I think it's making those proactive efforts to make a solid piece to invest at Howard University. I bet you there are top computer science students there, right? But
I will add in right here, not to plug MassBio, but to say that we are expanding our relationships and opportunities with Morehouse School of Medicine to expand our bio entrepreneurial system, to exchange resources, to work with their PIs and their researchers, and also have different funnels for our venture capitals to work with. And working closely with Dr. Dawes and working closely with Dr. Taylor. And we're going to make sure that we're going to expand that pipeline, and it's reciprocal. It's going both directions. So just want to make sure that people are aware that MassBio and its members are tapping into those underutilized resources that are rich and are great target environments for clinical research and for talent into the STEM pipeline. So didn't want to let anyone think that we're sleeping on this. And we have been very active with building these relationships since 2017 and 2018. So the MassBio members have acknowledged this, and we're working hard to build those bridges. And you're going to see the fruits of this labor coming shortly. And with that being said, we have a couple of questions that have come in. One person would like to know, I would love to show this and share this with my team. Will this be a recording or publicly available? The answer is yes. So we're going to make sure we're going to share a YouTube link after we've cleaned up the recording and make this publicly available. And it's going to go through our follow-up email that we send to people that have participated. But please shoot me an email at edie.stringfellow@massbio.org. If you can put that into the chat section and share my email address. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm Insta. I'm everywhere. I just want to make sure that you have access to this very thought-provoking conversation that Peter and Manny has started. I mean, now we're talking about different areas, and we're talking about things we should be talking about. This is real, and this is happening right now. And we also have another question that just came in for Peter. Peter, would you be able to talk about other requirements beyond fairness that AI should meet to be considered trustworthy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. There's a couple of them, such as, and I'll explain them, but value alignment, explainability, transparency, accuracy, robustness, accountability. All those aspects are important, and they're also interrelated. You know, that's the bummer. For instance, let me take two ones that are maybe somewhat interrelated. One is explainability and transparency. You know, so I think specifically for these type of applications, it's really important that we understand. Let's say you have a clinical clinical decision system that provides diagnosis advice, that it should be able to explain itself. So how did we get to this decision or prediction? So that's the explainability and the transparency side of the coin. On the flip side, of course, accuracy and robustness is also important. So if I will tell you, like, I have one model and it performs 20% better in terms of making predictions than the other one, but it cannot explain itself really well, what do? Yeah, there is a trade-off there, right? So unfortunately, people sometimes think that advanced methods are always more capable. That's not the case. You have simple AI methods that perform as good or sometimes even better. When there's a lot of uncertainty, actually, these simple systems work even better than the complex ones. But you see here these kind of different requirements. On one side, explainability and transparency. On the other side, accuracy and robustness. And somehow we need to find a way to deal with that particular trade-off. Could be different for different types of applications as well.
Thank you, Peter. We have a question now for Manny. You talked about the research that's taking place out in Stanford, and someone wrote, according to Stanford Center for Artificial Intelligence and Medicine Imaging, most of AI data sets comes from just 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York. If data is supposed to mirror our communities, why only these 3 states, and what are the ramifications?
Correct, which is a great point also. If you look at those 3 states, and you look at venture capital money and investments, they're located in those states, right? If you look at Boston, New York, San Francisco, that's where you find the entrepreneurs. And so they partner with your local hospitals and local universities. And you also have large health systems where you could get massive data sets. Outside of this large health systems, everything is siloed, especially in the US. Yeah, you don't have this interoperability, which is a big problem here, right? With data sets, you might go to one hospital and you're not able to share your data with the hospital right across the street from where you are, because hospitals are locking up all these data sets internally because they compete with each other. That's another piece. And then you have the whole discussion around privacy and everything else, which I think is a good excuse just to not do it, because you could do it right in a safe way. I'm sure, Peter, you could attest to that. It could be done in a safe way to make sure it's secure. So I think those are the challenges around this. That's why I think it's very important to have these partnerships with not the so larger universities or health systems, but to go where the people are to actually do the research, right? Because the whole industry is fragmented and biased from where it comes from, right? And that's exactly what we're talking about. So how do we share the wealth? And how do we create this kind of relationships? And I think it's like through networking kind of opportunities, right? Like Peter now, I know Peter. So if I see I'm working with someone, from Morehouse, because you mentioned Morehouse. Now, Eddie, you could say, hey, I know Peter. Peter becomes a mentor and advisor kind of piece, right? Does Pega now set up a relationship with a university in Atlanta or in Mississippi or wherever? Those are the kind of relationships we have to do. So I think we all could play a role to make sure this works.
I definitely support you, believe you. As you know, I've been working with health equity and beating this drum, and we're answering the call. So if anyone out there has other suggestions, any of the audience, if it's a way that you want to help connect, help participate, if you're at a HBCU, we have 4 medical schools that we're working with. We have Howard, we have Morehouse, we have McCary, and we also have Drew University out there in Los Angeles. We also are working with Tribal College and University, their medical school, the osteopathic school at Cherokee Nation, that's being supported by Oklahoma State University. And we're looking to expand our relationship with University of Puerto Rico School of Medicine. So we are making sure that we're doing it, but we can't do it alone. So I'm more than happy to connect with anyone with ideas, relationships, networks, resources. We can't keep this siloed. So again, jump in where you can. I'm open ears, open-minded, and so is the MassBio community. And we're looking to grow that and grow in any way that you see fit. And we have another question that's coming in for Peter right now. Peter, regarding workplace culture and talent, how can we foster a culture of responsible application of AI and bias prevention?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So how do you foster that culture? So yeah, like I think there's a couple of elements, right? So first off, it is the hiring. Like I said before, it is important, even that in that example of that study, you cannot assume that a certain group has less bias than another one, but a more diverse team will have less bias. So it is important to hire diversively, but it's also very important, of course, to operationalize all these principles. And I think that's where that's the situation where we're now in. That I think that people are becoming more and more aware of these ethical AI aspects and requirements, whether it's transparency, explainability, bias, fairness. I think the next step is how do we actually operationalize that, right? So how do we turn that into something tangible? Could be capabilities, could be methodologies, could be how you set up your governance and who's going to approve the use of certain algorithms or systems. But you need to make it. You also need to make it operational, right? So it's a mix of the people, making sure that people are aware that bias exists and that there's a culture where people care about bias being fixed, and addressing other responsible AI issues. But then also importantly, make sure it's not just talk. It's not just AI washing, or ethical AI washing, where lots of people are talking about it, but it's not being translated into, and that sounds very boring, procedures, process, tools, data, capability. And I know that sounds, I said jokingly boring, but only then it becomes real. Yeah. So beyond just policy. Yeah.
You've made AI very interesting right now. So no, boring would not be the word I associated with this. You and Manny have me really excited about it. And we're coming up on the last few minutes of the program. So Manny, to what extent hiring diverse teams help, but also is it sufficient enough? What else should we be doing that we have not discussed yet?
The reality of what happens. I mean, if you look at most companies that raise funds, the requirements of serial entrepreneur came from Ivy League schools. These are specific things I look at if you just look up job descriptions and you say, is that in there? Right? And no one challenges that aspect of it. You want the best of the people that go to the best schools. And not everyone has access to those schools, right? But that's what people look for. So there is bias on that side of it. And then once in a while, you might get a token piece where for diversity's sake, you get someone in, but the person does not get respect from the rest of the team because you're not coming in, right? Because people have this bias. It's a real thing that happens in the world. I think a lot of this is within networks. Honestly, we all know networks work, right? Being part of a network, like a MassBio kind of community works, right? Or being a network with Peter kind of works. I've been in situations where I've seen hiring teams. The question is, do you play golf or do you do this? Well, you don't play golf, then forget it, right? I mean, look at people like them. People look for people like them to hang out with.
Yeah.
Right? Or things people like. I'm biased towards people that are interested in AI, for example, right? Most of my friends are interested in AI or in adventure space, right? So we're all biased. So the idea is, how do we make our networks broader? That's, I think, is a solution, because if Peter knows more people like myself, I know more people like Peter, and we know people like Edie, then we could reference people within our network and community, right? Because we all love each other. We want this to work. So it's a network. Let's just broaden our network and keep advocating for each other. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and we're about to close out the program. And from what I'm gathering, biases and data often reflect deep and hidden imbalances in institutional infrastructures. And we talked about social power relationships. And to address some of these issues, we need for machine learning researchers must engage with social scientists and experts in humanities, gender, medicine, and the environment. And from what you're saying here, it has to start at the undergraduate level. Students should examine the social context of AI at the same time as they are learning about algorithms work. AI must not unintentionally sustain or even worsen these problems. I would like to thank both Peter and Manny for being here, for sharing their insight and expertise. We look forward to continuing the conversation. I hope that Peter and Manny does not have a problem with me putting them on blast, but I'm going to share their contact information in the chat section so people who are looking to continue to network with them are able to do so. And don't wait to reach out to them. Click on their emails right now. Thank everyone for attending and for participating. And thank you, Thermo Fisher, for making Shift happen. Stay tuned for more information on how your organization can partner with MassBio and Fisher Scientific to support minority-owned businesses. Last but not least, if I don't see you sooner, I look forward to seeing you next Monday at the MassBio Town Hall, where we will discuss vaccine hesitancy in Black and Brown communities. To register, please visit massbio.org/events, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.